Hi, it's Matthew Matt here. A big part of my work focuses on how we can use math to understand our world and especially to understand issues of injustice. So today I'm going to talk about how math can help us understand racism and school discipline. This video comes at a time of widespread protests around police brutality in particular and around racism in our society more broadly. They were sparked by the murder of George Floyd, but they're based on long-standing injustices. I just want to be clear that racism is real and this is not a space for debating that reality. We're going to look at how math can illustrate one example of racism and how it plays out in schools. As I said, a lot of my work focuses on using math to understand important social and political issues. Doing this comes with both possibilities and tensions. In terms of possibilities, math is often thought of as objective or neutral, and it carries power and authority in our society, so it might be an entry point for getting people to listen or think about a topic they might not otherwise. Relatedly, math also provides a unique lens that is different than other disciplines. It can allow for more of a big picture look, and for some people it provides some emotional distance, so it can be another way to enter a topic. In terms of tensions, math is not actually neutral or objective, especially when it comes to the real world. We have to make choices and decisions about how to use mathematics and how to interpret it, and these have real impacts on people's lives. There's a tension because we don't want to reinforce the idea that you should be listening just because it's math, but it's also an opportunity because we can use real world connections to uncover or talk about some of the political aspects of mathematics. Math is only one lens, and we want to be careful to emphasize that we need a range of perspectives to understand complex issues. They don't begin and end with the mathematics. That's just one component to it. Related to that is we need to really be careful not to forget the context and the real human impact or experiences behind the math we're doing. There are real people behind these numbers, and when we're working with students, we really need to think about their feelings and experiences related to these topics. Finally, we can run the risk of being exploitative if we don't give adequate attention to the real world context, instead just treat it as sort of like a catchy or engaging way to get into the math, and that would be problematic. So let's talk about how schools discipline their students. You may have heard of the school to prison pipeline, which the ACLU describes as practices where children are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. They created this infographic, and I'll have a link in the description below for it. And some of the facts from it are that school disciplinary policies disproportionately affect Black students, which is what we're going to explore a little bit today, and that students who have been suspended or expelled are nearly 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system the following year. So the problem here is that is that the practices in schools are leading students into the criminal justice system. And then that's especially problematic in a form of systemic racism when it disproportionately affects Black students. So we're going to imagine a hypothetical school. It's going to be about the size of Cincinnati public schools, which means it's going to have about 35,000 students, and it's going to be a microcosm for the US. It's going to be like a little mini version of all US schools shrunk down into this one school. It'll have the same overall demographics and the same amount of discipline issues. Some of the largest disparities are between white and Black students, and for this video, that's what I'm going to focus on. So our school looks like this. It has 18,000 white students, 5,700 Black or African American students, and 11,300 students of all other races, for a total of 35,000 students. The data come from the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, and there's a link in the description below. Now, my intent is not to erase other students. The all other categories includes a lot of different types of students. It includes students who have 2 or more races, students who are Hispanic or Latinx, who are Native Hawaiian or from other Pacific Islanders, students who are Asian, students who are American Indians, students who are Alaskan Natives. There's always a tension in condensing the data and grouping it in particular ways, including the terms I just used. However, if we never group the data, we can't identify patterns, and the focus today is on disparities between white and Black students. So let's look at that in a little more detail. Overall, in this school, we would expect there to be about 92 expulsions. And so we might ask, well, how many of those would we expect to be white students or Black students or from other races? Essentially, we can look at whites. Let's start by looking at white students. About half of them, or about 51% of the whole student body, is white students. So we would expect about half of the expulsions to be from white students as well, which gives us 47. We can do a similar computation for Black students, who are about 16% of the total student body, which would give us about 15 expulsions. and that leaves 30 expulsions for all other races. Now let's look at what actually happens when we look at schools across the United States. We end up with 33 white students expelled, 32 black students, and 27 from all other races. The first question we want to ask is, are these numbers problematic? To me, on their face, because the numbers are so extreme, it's clear that they're problematic. If we look just at the black students, for instance, they're getting expelled by twice as much as we would expect. But we also, especially as mathematicians and social scientists, want to ask a follow-up question. Can we quantify how problematic this is? It can help us in talking about how out of alignment things are and in raising awareness about it. For instance, one of the facts from the ACLU infographic was that black students are suspended and expelled 3 times more than white students. We want to ask how they came up with this value and where does it show up in the numbers we have here. So we can't really compare the 33 and 32 directly because they're different numbers of overall students, right? They're out of a different population. So to make a more direct comparison, we might think about what happens for every 1,000 students. Essentially, we're asking, if I just look at 1,000 white students, how many of them do I expect to be expelled? And same thing if I look at 1,000 black students, how many of them are expelled? So we have 33 expelled white students out of a total of 18,000 students. And we want to know, what would this be? What would the number be if it were just out of 1,000 students? So essentially, I'm solving that proportion. And when I do that, we end up with about 1.8 students expelled. We can do something similar for Black and African American students, and we end up with about 5.6 Black students expelled out of every 1,000, and we end up with 2.4 for all their races. This helps show how extreme the differences are, and it lets us see where the ACLU infographic came from. 5.6 is about 3 times as much as 1.8. It's actually slightly more. So Black students in the US are being expelled at 3 times the rate as white students. Said another way, if you're a Black student in the US, your chances of being expelled are 3 times as high as if you're a white student in the US, and that's really problematic. Now the math here helps us see that a problem exists, but it doesn't unpack why things are like this. There are several possible explanations people often give, and I'm going to summarize what the research has found about each of these. There are citations for the articles this comes from in the description below. So one explanation people offer sometimes is that maybe Black students just misbehave more, and that's why there are more disciplinary issues. The research on this is pretty clear that that's not the case. Studies have consistently found that students misbehave at similar rates. A second possible explanation is that this isn't really about race, it's more about rates of poverty, which unfortunately in the US are different based on race. The research on this is also pretty clear that that's not the case. A number of studies have found that even after adjusting for socioeconomic status, Black students are more likely to be disciplined and or disciplined more severely than their white peers. Another possible explanation is that teachers are biased, that they're treating students differently, whether they're doing it on purpose or not. And the research says, yes, this is a factor. Teachers are more likely to refer Black students to the office than white students for similar behaviors. This is likely due to differing cultural expectations about behavior and or to implicit biases and negative expectations that teachers have about Black students. Another possible explanation is that the administrators are biased. So let's say a teacher sends a kid to the office, how the principal deals with that situation may be biased. The research says probably or maybe. After controlling for other factors, Black students do seem to be more likely to receive harsher punishments than white students, but there are also less studies and some offer conflicting results. Finally, one explanation is that the schools that Black students go to are stricter. So the more Black students there are in a school, the stricter the policies might be. And the research says, yes, this is a factor. Schools with a higher percentage of Black students tend to have stricter discipline policies and attitudes among the teachers and principals. In one study, the authors wrote that attending a school with more Black students increases a student's risk of suspension nearly as much as involvement in drugs, weapons, or assaults, which is a pretty extreme result. They describe it as a shocking result. This highlights how racism is systemic. Yes, individual biases in teachers and administrators are a factor, but it's also systemic. We've created a society in which schools that Black students attend are much stricter and therefore lead to more disciplinary issues. So even if we eliminated all individual biases, the system would still be racist. I might go into a school and that individual teacher is treating kids the same way, and in another school, a teacher is treating kids the same way. But one school has much harsher disciplinary practices, and that school on average in the US, those schools tend to be attended by more Black students. All right, to bring it together, I want to highlight that math can provide one lens for understanding injustices. We want students who come out of our school system to be able to use math in these ways, to really be able to understand and unpack our world. One challenge is that to a lot of people, this doesn't always feel like math. And I and many other educators have argued that we need to really reimagine what counts as math and why we don't value these kinds of activities in the classroom.